Yeah, I'd like to welcome everybody to the history of the Commission project, another edition. And today I have the pleasure of talking with David Goodman, who is the chapter leader of Represent US in New Jersey. And before we start, I'd just like to just go over your background a little bit, which is very, very extensive and very impressive.
Well, thank you.
Fundraising, you're involved in fundraising, program development, research, administration, and economic development. And you also hold a doctorate in history from Clark University in Worcester, Mass. I hope I pronounced Worcester correctly.
Actually, they say Worcester.
Worcester,
Yeah,
okay.
That's all right.
Don't have a Massachusetts accent here. Why don't we start off with, if you want to talk a little bit about your background. I think that the audience would be interested in hearing.
Well,
something
thank you
about
very much. First of all, thanks very much for inviting me. Happy to tell you a little bit about the work we're doing at Represent Us.
Great.
I guess I would just say if there's a pattern to the different career opportunities I had through 2013, excuse me, I had an opportunity to work with really some of the leading figures in science and medicine, especially with a special focus on cancer research. Had the opportunity to raise, as it turns out, some significant funds for research, for fellowship programs, for young investigator programs. I don't think there's anybody who hasn't been touched in terms of family or friends with that dreaded disease. So any
absolutely.
work that we can do to advance research and new treatments is something that I'm very proud to have been associated with.
No, you
So,
should be. That's incredible.
yeah,
Incredible.
so
Important.
and an opportunity to finally hone some of my organizational skills. So I concluded that work at the turn of the calendar in 2013. And without getting ahead of your questions, I would just say just started a new chapter of my life and my work at that point, nearly a decade into this
Wow.
current effort.
Yeah, it's quite a background. And, eventually it brought you to New Jersey politics and government. And
I would add. You're right about that. One thing that I had a great opportunity in terms of working with political leaders, especially in the legislature and the governor's office. I was the founding deputy director of a then new state agency called the New Jersey Commission on Science and Technology.
wow.
This was during the early 1980s when a number of states were looking to extend the work of their research universities and looking at models in North Carolina, the so-called Route 128 corridor in Massachusetts, and ultimately Silicon Valley in California. Some pretty heavy competition.
Yeah.
But New Jersey had a reputation, well deserved, as being the medicine cabinet of the nation, with at that time heavy concentration of pharmaceutical
Right,
companies
sure.
in New Jersey. So we worked to create new partnerships between the universities, Rutgers probably being in the lead, but also worked with New Jersey Institute of Technology and Stevens Institute of Technology, Stevens Tech. Princeton got involved in the effort. So we created some new partnerships. But anyway, I mentioned that only because it was an opportunity for me to understand how the legislative process and some of the hardball efforts that happen in this wonderful state of ours
Right.
take place. So with your introduction is right, but I really did have a
No, that's just what I wanted to give you the opportunity to
absolutely
talk a little bit about, which I kind of do with everybody that we interview. One of the areas I believe that Represent US has been involved in and very interested in is redistricting, particularly as it applies to New Jersey. And with regard to redistricting, I think we could probably divide it into two parts. The first part was redistricting having to do with population, and the second to do with the shapes of the district, which is really where we're at now with gerrymandering. The population situation was, of course, was dealt with with a Supreme Court decision in 1962 with Baker versus Carr,
Mm-hmm.
and Justice Brennan, who issued the majority opinion, basically that decision had to do with it had always been the tradition of the Supreme Court to keep hands off in terms of, the redistricting that took place every 10 years because it was considered a political question. But with the decision in '62, it opened the door for the federal courts to begin to intervene with regard to this question. And then ultimately in '64, with Reynolds versus Sims, basically it was the concept that was developed out of that decision was one person, one vote. In other words, every state legislative district had to be equal in terms of population. So that particular issue has been pretty much resolved in terms of the population aspect of districts. But then now what we're dealing with in a lot of states, including New Jersey, is the gerrymandering district, which has to do with the shape of the district. And you've probably heard of the Fishhook district that was established a number of years ago, which extended from Bergen County all the way down to Ocean County and looked like a fishhook. In other words, putting certain towns in that district to benefit one party or the other. I'm not really sure which party it benefited at that time with the Fishhook district. But anyway, if you'd like to, talk a little bit about represent the U.S.'s involvement with the gerrymandering issue.
Well, let me thank you, and I wish I could. We could all rest comfortably when we what is it, stare decisis? Is that the Latin term, settled law?
Precedent, yeah.
I probably garbled that one.
Well, neither one of us is a lawyer, so.
But you do give a good explanation of these decisions. Interesting in the 1960s. I mean, I guess the looming factor in the background is the decision of the court to overturn Roe v. Wade in terms of so-called settled law. I mean, that's off the topic of your question, but it does give pause and concern to all of us as to the direction, perhaps the willingness of the Supreme Court to remain in terms of supporting the precedents that were established years ago. The broader context to your question, Jeff, is we represent us, and I want to give a little history. The organization was started nationally in 2012 after the presidential election that year. A recognition, but also in recognition or concern for the tsunami of funds, of independent, unaccounted, so-called dark money that began to flood the election in 2012 following the Citizens United decision. That was truly a watershed decision affecting very much of the work that we've done, and of course I know is of great concern in terms of the data and the regulatory and legislative recommendations that you and ELEC have made to the legislature. The chapter that I currently lead was started a year later in 2013. So the opportunity that I had when I was concluding my work in cancer research and fundraising to move into this area, while not totally seamless, sort of finding my sea legs in the first few months when I decided to make that change, but it actually proved to be a good fit, and I believe I've grown into that. The national organization, working with a number of legal scholars, including Trevor Potter, who was I think at what time was the chair of the Federal Election Commission,
Right. Yeah.
Lawrence Lessig, who's a Harvard Law scholar, and several others, crafted something called the American Anti-Corruption Act, which is sort of the template or the guiding focus for the work that we do. And that it sets a number of areas of focus where changes and reforms are called for, and really gives an opportunity to energize our volunteers. I mean, obviously in different areas, different states, different segments of that law are used. So it's more of a model rather than necessarily it's a pretty ambitious set of provisions, and of course it includes action to work against gerrymandering, which is the point, I think, of your question.
Right. Yeah, I know Trevor Potter is a well-known name.
Right.
In this particular area.
Right.
Well, also in terms of campaign finance.
Exactly. Yeah, I think he's now currently, or he was chairman of a group called the Campaign Legal Center. Do I have that?
Maybe that sounds like that could
one
be
of the
case,
founding,
yeah.
one of the founding.
Yeah.
Individuals in that. So
Yeah.
yeah, he's been very critical. He's critical in the positive sense. Yeah, I mean, we're very much committed to gerrymandering. But if I can return to the concerns that many of us have, certainly in the democracy reform movement that I'm associated with, it's the reluctance of the Supreme Court to take on some of these issues, and when it does act, as it is acting, unfortunately, I think, to eviscerate the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And most recently, there's been a hearing, or a case brought before it that might further erode that substantial bit of civil rights legislation, but also the reluctance of the court. And the Chief Justice Roberts has been most vocal about a reluctance of the court to deal with so-called partisan gerrymandering. That was a real disappointment.
Roberts is kind of, with regard to these issues, has kind of been taking the former position of it's a political issue and it's not really something where the courts should intervene. He's been more along those lines, I think.
I would acknowledge that. My organization, along with the Campaign Legal Center and others, filed legal briefs to support the case that had to do with partisan gerrymandering. And I know that I don't know if it was Sotomayor or Kagan, but some of the dissenters in that decision were pretty vocal about their concern about the reluctance of the court to even touch this partisan. I mean, I guess the chief sort of presented it as a third rail that was best, as you say, left the political forces. But unfortunately, both, certainly in the U.S. Congress and the House and the Senate over several years now, there doesn't seem to be the political will or the number of votes to get something done.
Right.
So in the absence of that, we often turn to the courts. But yeah, so gerrymandering and the concerns about campaign finance reform, issues that's on the latter issue that you and I have worked on in earlier points, they continue to be very much a part of the focus of Represent Us, but we've experienced some victories there, but also some significant setbacks too. So.
Yeah, you mentioned the Voting Rights Act, and I think that with the gerrymandering issue is mostly related to that.
Correct.
And not being able to deprive anyone of the right to vote on the basis of race. It started.
I think the racial part, so far at least, we'll see what this latest
Right.
decision is, because this has to do, I think, with the representation that the state of Alabama,
The Alabama case, yeah.
right. given the demographic realities, namely the size of the African American population, deserves perhaps more than one
district,
packed
Mhm.
district.
Right.
You know, packing and cracking. Those are the terms that
Minority, majority districts, more than one minority, majority.
Use.
Yeah, right.
So I think the court, we'll see what their final decision is. I guess these tend to come out toward the end of the term.
Yeah.
But it could be that the court will further erode the Voting Rights Act.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. I think the Alabama case could come down to either two issues. Either is it based on, is it race, or is it to give partisan advantage? What is the purpose of the decision that was made by the legislature in Alabama? Is it to give a certain party an advantage, or is it really to deal with the racial situation?
I'm probably going to have to defer to you on that one. I'm not sure I know.
So they're the two issues that are involved in the Alabama case.
Yeah.
So we'll find out, as you say, fairly soon, I would think. But,
there's a concern. I mean, I'm not doing much more than reciting the headlines, I guess, although I suppose depends on your source. But there's a concern that the so-called supermajority of conservative justices on the current court are pursuing some of these issues with a degree of aggressiveness that is concerning. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when, and you mentioned the 60s, the late Justice Brennan and others. I think it was a little bit later than the 60s, but I'm old enough to remember when the so-called liberal bent of the court at that time was pilloried for so-called judicial activism. I remember that phrase coming about. And, I dare say I think we're dealing with on the conservative side.
I think you're right. I think that
level of activism which is
that phrase applies to both sides, depending on which. Who controls the court, really.
Yeah, exactly.
It's either conservative activism or liberal activism.
Well, in this case, the concern is that and I think it may begin actually with, or did begin with Citizens United, because the Citizens United case had initially a much more, if my memory and understanding of the proceedings is correct, had a much more narrow focus, but the justices, it may have been Chief Justice Roberts, actually invited the plaintiffs to submit additional material, which led to a much more sweeping decision, essentially judging that free speech and money had a kind of they were kindred spirits, so to speak.
Well, certainly, Citizens United certainly facilitated, as we're both concerned about, the growth in independent spending. But I would actually go back to the bipartisan Campaign Reform Act back in, 2002, to where the increase in independent spending really started. Because there was a tremendous increase between that that act and the Citizens United case, in 2010.
Being the sort of
the growth,
a stepwise approach. And where did Buckley Vallejo come into that?
That was way back in the 1970s.
Oh, really?
Which, that case was a seminal case as well.
Correct.
With regard to this issue. But of course, as you know, with regard to the gerrymandering issue, that is a concern to a lot of people. The U.S. Constitution gives the state legislatures the authority to determine how the districts are to be drawn every 10 years as a result of the census.
Right.
And in New Jersey, what we've done is we've created commissions. Do you have any thoughts on that? Rather than the state legislature drawing the maps, they've now delegated that responsibility to commissions for the congressional redistricting as well as state legislature.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose delegating it is not an inappropriate way to characterize it, but I'm not sure it's all it's all that meaningful.
That solved the problem.
Well, I mean, as I understand it, the two parties pretty much nominate members to serve on this commission, and then they choose a tiebreaker. Often
the Chief Justice.
also the Chief Justice is authorized, and
as the 11th member.
Exactly, and I believe that's the way things happened in the most recent redistricting. Look, we supported both in terms of citizen engagement and opportunities through our meetings, our use of social media and so forth. We supported the League of Women Voters of New Jersey position, which essentially is the California model, which is for an independent commission, very different from what New Jersey has done. And
maybe explain that. I mean, I'm not familiar with that, actually.
well, I'm not sure if I'm the best authority on that, but I think the way the California legislature agreed to deal with redistricting was to create a commission composed of non-elected officials who would spend considerable amount of time. I mean, they had fora throughout the state of California. Of course, it's a huge bit of geography to cover, meeting with constituents and so forth, and with voters, and they made their recommendations to the, however the process was finalized. You know, look, the reality from our point of view, my point of view, is that much of this effort on redistricting, or the way it's done in New Jersey and other states, is really an attempt to maintain a level of control by the two parties, as opposed to bringing in the voices of citizens who may reflect something different from what the political leaders want. You know, I testified before committees in the Assembly and the State Senate during the time when we were doing these things on live. And one of the things that I said, not necessarily an original statement, but I hope one that was pointed, was that we view elections and redistricting as an opportunity for the people, the public, to decide its political configurations rather than for politicians to choose their voters.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think the latter has often tended to be the way it's happened here. I mean, you read, and I'm sure you consume the news as much as I do, and know that the midterm elections, which are now only weeks away, that the districts were configured in such a way that the Democrats were able to, with the exception of one district, I guess it's the 7th congressional district, Tom Malinowski and Tom Kaine Jr., that they were able to give a decided advantage to incumbents. It does tend, as far as I'm concerned, and this touches on a bigger issue, tends to give a decided edge to incumbency. I think it turns into a discouragement to voter participation. Many people feel, well, why bother voting? These guys are pretty much decided, some might say rigged the outcome before it's even happened. And in some states, not necessarily quite as extreme as in New Jersey, as in other states rather, as in other states I should say, the primary election turns out to be the most meaningful election, or the general election tends just to be a confirmation of the primary. So there's something that's at loose ends and that's odd about the state of our democracy these days.
Well, I think
of deep concern to people like myself that work in this sphere.
Right. Well, I mean, what you're touching upon is really an issue that goes back to the beginnings of the republic, really, in terms of the in terms of the redistricting. And so, as the parties became more prominent, and it really got to a situation where every 10 years, whichever party was in control, either the legislature or in control of the commissions and so forth, they would create a map which was beneficial to their party so that they would have more representatives. And so that was the issue with the population, but it's also now the issue with gerrymandering with the shapes of the district. And it's not just in New Jersey, but it's in other states as well.
Oh, it's much more flagrant elsewhere.
Iowa and other places.
You talk about the fishhook. I guess I hadn't heard that one, but there's one, I don't know if this is Pennsylvania or North Carolina, but it's referred to as Donald Duck kicking Goofy in the rear. I mean, that's that.
It could be, yeah. There are all kinds of ways to describe these districts that would be said, all for the purpose of giving advantage to whichever party was in control.
Yeah.
So both parties, played a role in the redistricting process and benefiting them each other.
Not condemning one party over the other. I think we have some concerns about the whole nature of our political structure today. But that's perhaps further down the line in terms of your question.
No, that's good. That kind of segues into my next question. With Represent U.S., you support ranked choice voting.
Very much so.
I guess first of all, if you can explain that, because I think a lot of people are somewhat confused about how that's changing. From a plurality system where the first to the post, the winner,
right?
Whoever gets the most votes is the winner.
Right.
This works differently, right?
It does, but I think unfortunately for the general public has been misrepresented often by elected leaders who frankly may fear that it challenges their opportunities to control the outcome. I was going back through some of my papers before I came here. It was just a year ago this month, actually, that I published a piece in New Jersey Spotlight, which is the online newspaper, if you will, of that organization. And the title
connected with NJN.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. And the title of that piece was "Ranked Choice Voting Coming to a Neighborhood Near You," and that really led to the recommendation that I was making that I thought was necessary for New Jersey to make some progress. But let me respond with some data, at least that was.
Well, first, how does it work? I mean,
well, I'll tell you that. I will tell that to you in a moment, but I just want to give you a sense that this is not a radical, aberrant format. When I wrote the piece a year ago, the data showed that 9.3 million people had already voted in elections where ranked choice voting or instant runoff was the prevalent opportunity for deciding the outcome. That included 26 municipalities and then 2 states, Maine and Alaska. And Alaska most recently has had a very successful primary now heading into their general election, where they use a combination of nonpartisan open primaries and then ranked choice voting to decide who would be the winner. Ranked choice voting, unlike first past the post or the traditional plurality system, which we in this country assume is somehow sacrosanct. We've always done it this way. That's the way people try to defend it, as if there aren't additional or other ways to consider this. Ranked choice voting, first of all, requires a majority vote so that it doesn't end until a candidate achieves a majority. So that's 50% plus 1. And so that means that...
So is that transferring it from a plurality system to a majority electoral system?
Correct. If the on the
if I could say a majority
on the assumption that there are, and the model that we're talking about assumes that there are more than 2 candidates. So if you have 3 or more candidates, then you have to work through. Then the ranking. There's also, the mathematicians have all sorts of words for this, Monte Carlo systems and so forth, to explain how these things happen. But I mean, if you have, it's a majority outcome. It removes or certainly reduces the so-called spoiler effect. I mean, we know from some elections, the Ralph Nader experience in Gore versus Bush, and I guess it was 2000, the Ross Perot candidacy. More recently, in 2016, the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein. These were all seen as spoilers and people who argue against the third party, the so-called third party effect, with some justifications. Understand that the nature of our constitutional system, as opposed to a parliamentary system as they have in Europe and in other places, almost prefigures a two-party system. You alluded to that in the beginning.
Parliamentary system, more of a multi-party system.
Exactly, yeah. The founders, and I don't know if it was Madison or Adams or one of the founders who were prolific, and certainly Madison in terms of the Federalist Papers, but really expressing the fear of so-called factions, and which
Madison Federalist 10 did,
right?
yeah.
Which of course is the term that they used before the Jacksonian period, when we had parties as the expression of factionalism. So ranked choice voting is a majority outcome. By the way, if as happened in the Senate candidate campaign rather in Maine, where Susan Collins achieved a majority in the first round, that ends it. So ranked choice voting doesn't require the multiple rounds that people are concerned about if in fact a candidate achieves a majority outcome. But it does require that benchmark to happen.
Let me just stop you for 1 minute
Sure.
just to clarify something. Now, with what you're talking about, a majority electoral system, does that mean that the candidate who wins must receive more votes than all the other candidates combined, or just the most votes? Because with a majority system,
right,
the candidate has to receive more votes than all of the other candidates combined.
well, ultimately that would be the case.
Right.
If you have, let me use the 2016 presidential election as an example. Where you had 4 candidates. You had Donald Trump. You had Hillary Clinton.
Right.
So it was Republican, Democrat, but you also had Gary Johnson running as a Libertarian, and you had Jill Stein. I mentioned her as the Green Party standard bearer. So let's say, for argument's sake, that I like Jill Stein's position. I'm very strong on environmental issues, but I'm afraid that if under a traditional system, that if I vote for Jill Stein, it's what's known as a wasted vote. In other words, in the first pass, the post-plurality system, the likelihood of Jill Stein accumulating not only a majority but a plurality, if you want to use that standard, is very slim. So people did not, they tended to stay away from the third-party candidates. The same would be true with Gary Johnson offsetting Donald Trump. In the ranked choice voting opportunity, you get your ballot, and you have an opportunity to choose 1, 2, 3, but you can't use the same person 3 times. That's the one rule. So you vote for Jill Stein as your first candidate, and you vote for Hillary Clinton as your second, and then the ballots go through a tabulation process. And in the end, when it turns out that Jill Stein does not accumulate enough votes to go on to the second round, and no majority is achieved in that first round, her votes are discounted, and all people who chose the second candidate, that moves forward to the second round, and it continues to happen in that fashion until a majority is achieved.
Okay.
So it does require some level, some effort at voter education. There's no question about that. We had the opportunity in the New York City Democratic primary in 2020, mayoral primary, but also for the down ballot votes for city council and so forth, to look at the work that Common Cause of New York did to educating voters, and they did a short but really very informative, informational video. I'm sure, as is the case in all these things, there's some selective editing on these things, but the message that came through was that New York City voters were not at all discouraged from voting, did not find the composition of the ballot all that confusing. They needed to know in advance how the process worked. But once they did, they realized it's not all that different from choices that we make in everyday life. So I want chocolate ice cream, but there's not enough people interested. So how about vanilla? And then if vanilla doesn't come back, it turns out that the third choice was the majority choice in strawberries, so we choose that. In other words, that kind of ranking, the way we rank things in our everyday life, is really not that different, and not really different at all from what ranked choice voting involves. It does require some different configuration of the ballot, but people who also say, oh, but you're violating, and you alluded to the earlier one man, one vote decision. You're only voting once. You're not coming back.
Right. So in other words,
at the initial time you vote, right, you make a ranking selection, but you're only voting once. People malign the system because they really are afraid of the way of the.
But you're voting. You have your first choice, right? And then you vote for a second choice, right?
You're doing it all at the same time, though.
Right, but then all of those are added up to whoever gets the majority.
Well, the process that I've described to achieve that majority outcome would take place, but it's not a notion that people are then invited to come in and vote a second time. Some people choose to use the ballot in a traditional way. They like that first candidate, and they put that name in. As long as they don't misuse the process and choose candidate Jones and say, well, I like him, but I'm going to do him 1, 2, and 3 on the same ballot, because then you voided your ballot. But if you just choose candidate Jones that you won, and you want to leave 2 and 3 alone, that's how you vote.
Some of the, I guess one of the criticism is going to cause delays in determining who the winner is. How would you answer that?
I think we need to get over the notion of, if we want to use the November general election date, what is it, the 8th this time around, as somehow singular and determinative. I mean, look what happened with our gubernatorial election, when we had 3 forms of voting, and none of which, by the way, had to do with ranked choice voting.
Right.
We had mail-in ballots, we had early voting, and we had the traditional voting on election day. So there were clearly some delays in reporting, and that gave rise, unfortunately, in the times that we live in, that are rife with conspiracy allegations and if not disinformation. And there were suggestions that somehow there was something fraudulent was happening. I'd have to say
I think the people are used to having a winner on election day.
Of course they are. But I'm not sure. But I'm not sure that's necessarily the way we need to see things going forward. There's some education that could happen on the part of the elected leaders as well to explain the process. Now, but let me add to that. We could do a lot better to increase the foot soldiers in the county and local election offices by increasing their funding. These are wonderful. I had the opportunity. You were good enough to put me in touch with the County Commissioner, Hunterdon County, for some
Mary Melfi,
exactly,
County Clerk.
Yeah, County Clerk. Thank you. Wonderful people.
Yes, very good.
They work without fanfare or public attention on their work, but they do great work. I might add, by the way, in the perilous times that we are in right now, we might not be seeing it quite with such pronounced effect in New Jersey, but in other parts of the country, including across the river in Pennsylvania, election workers have been harassed and threatened and had their privacy invaded by people who are, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, up to no good. So, but to the point, we could do a lot better to give resources, more resources to the county clerks and the local election people, and get more volunteers to help with the process. Unfortunately, because people are frightened about getting involved in elections, we seem at a point in time, an inflection point where potentially we're going in the opposite direction, where we won't have enough people, and that would have the effect of actually extending the reporting process. So there are ways, in other words, to, with some modifications, when the mail-in ballots, in other words, can be, this gets into some technical issues, unsealed, and the curing process. I know that an assembly member, a state senator, Andrew Zwicker, that you and I both have some high regard for, has been in the forefront of making those legislative changes and so forth. There's certainly things that we could do to speed along the outcome. But the fact that you and I grew up in an era when by the end of the evening, maybe in the wee morning hours of election day, whatever November date, that we knew who the person was, that's not necessarily the entire gold standard for how we should view the election outcomes. I think we need to pursue things with integrity and concern for ballot security, but not necessarily feel that we can't allow for some of the changes that my organization in supporting ranked choice voting would like to see, which, by the way, has been used internationally. I think it's New Zealand has used ranked choice voting for decades. I mean, and there are parts of areas in Europe as well. The Academy Awards, by the way, are decided by ranked choice voting. Most people don't know that. So it may not be one's particular fancy, but the fact of the matter is, it's not some alien invasion that's taking over how we vote.
There's a variation of this in Europe, as you say, with the parliamentary systems, and depending on what country you're talking about. Germany has a little bit different system than Italy, but there's a form of the ranked choice voting in those.
It's more conducive to coalition building the way we have things in this country. But we're experiencing a gridlock effect, certainly when you come on the U.S. Senate side, and the inability to get anything done. And then when you add the filibuster, which is a conversation, I'm sure, for an entirely different time.
Well, and let me say, and your obvious support for ranked choice voting, does that have something to do with dissatisfaction with people we're electing, or to maybe improve?
I think that's probably a fair assessment and a fair question. Yeah. There's a desire to expand the opportunities of office holding. And I mean, look, Jeff, we've also taken a position, I don't know if this relates directly to your question, but we've taken a position, again, joining with the League of Women Voters and other organizations, against the so-called county line ballot. I don't know if it's widely known. I don't believe the leaders, some say power brokers in Trenton of either party, want to give much attention to the fact that the county line in New Jersey is our unique contribution to the ballot. none of the other 49 states in the United States configure their ballots the way we do in New Jersey, in that county line, whether it's a horizontal line or a vertical line.
Well, what we have in New Jersey is a party ballot, as opposed to an office ballot,
Okay.
which some other states have. Where you're with an office ballot, you're just putting everybody who's running for that office within this box.
Exactly.
Right.
And not putting people who don't get the county nod into what's known as a ballot Siberia. That's
Right.
off to the distance. And interestingly, in working with organizations, we work. By the way, the work that we do is far too much and embracing of so many reform efforts that represent us very often, and this really characterizes our work from the very beginning, going back to 2013, but certainly is true today. We work with a number of allies that have maybe even more specific foci on the issue that we're dealing with. So on this question of ballot design and ranked choice voting, we've worked very closely with a group called Voter Choice New Jersey and continue to work with them. One of the volunteers for that group, who was very successful in terms of a major ordinance that was approved a little while ago in the city of Hoboken. He did a lot of street petitioning and conversations with everyday voters, including discussions about the county line and the way the ballot was configured. And most people just had no idea that there was any other way of doing it. Well, this is the way it's always been done in New Jersey. I suppose you could say the same for other states as well. But the point is, often when you're trying to introduce a change or reform, you're dealing with the fact that people just assume this is always the way it's been from time immemorial.
Well, I think that, what you're talking about with regard to the party line and endorsements by parties and so forth, really, it goes back to another Supreme Court decision in '89, the U decision, EU, which involved the San Francisco Democratic Committee, and it had to do with an open primary, in which the court said that basically that the parties could endorse and they could be involved in, in their primary elections and so forth. So I think a lot of where that party line business comes from and endorsing candidates can be traced back to the U decision in '89, which, when you have a Supreme Court decision like that, that pretty much keeps that kind of thing intact.
Well, there's a good government coalition that's active in New Jersey. We've featured some of their leaders at our monthly meeting, and there's currently a challenge in court to take another look at that.
I was thinking they would probably have to look at the U decision if they were to change that.
It may well be,
but I don't know.
It may well be. Well, what we can say from real world experience is that those people who are reluctant to countenance some of the changes that we're talking about tend to have pretty deep pockets when it comes to being able to put together high-powered attorneys and arguments to maintain their case. So, and that was certainly true in the end dark money law that we both worked on.
I'm going to get to that in a minute, because that's an area that we really both agree on. I just wanted to say we're talking with David Goodman, who is the head of Represent U.S. here in New Jersey, and we're very happy again to have you.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Let me just move to an area where we really do agree on, and we'd like to see something done, and that's with regard to independent disclosure of independent groups in New Jersey, which right now is not really required under the law. Of course, we kind of work together, join forces in 2019 with regard to the legislation that was passed, ultimately passed, that required disclosure by independent groups, which we supported. I thought it was a very good bill, but it did have some constitutional problems, which ultimately it was challenged in court, and it was found to be unconstitutional by Judge Martinotti, by federal Judge Martinotti. But we have another effort going on now, which was kind of held up in the Assembly. It didn't move in the Assembly, but it did move, through the Senate, and that is the bipartisan bill, Scutari-Arroyo bill, S2866,
Right.
which does a number of other things besides requiring disclosure by independent groups. But we did do a lot of work. My staff here and I did a lot of work with the sponsor and with OLS to try to make it as constitutionally sound as possible with regard to disclosure of independent groups. Now, where are you on this bill and on that on independent disclosure?
Well,
generally speaking.
yeah. Let me say that first of all, let me applaud the work that you and your colleagues at ELEC have done in terms of doing a fine-tooth comb approach on the bill in terms of the constitutional provisions. The one that was approved in the Senate, I guess it's called the Elections Transparency Act.
Elections Transparency Act.
Yeah. I suspect part of the holdup in the Assembly may have been because of some of the objections that a number of groups expressed about the so-called pay-to-play provisions, which I know you thought were incorrect, if not a bit wrong-headed. The whole term pay-to-play, even if you are correct, and I have no reason to doubt that you are, it has a kind of incendiary connotation to it. I think you have effectively represented the point of the bill as to kind of create a more uniform standard as opposed to the different crazy quilt approaches that currently exist in pay-to-play. And I know that ELEC has published papers on that. I've read your work over the years. It's thoughtful and effective. The other provision of the bill, I think it's a three-legged stool, if I'm not mistaken, Jeff. The regulations of the independent expenditures, or so-called dark money, is one. Pay-to-play would be the second. And I guess the increase
in the contribution limit,
political parties would be able to obtain is the third. So let me just say that
not only political parties, but candidates as well.
Okay.
Would increase the contribution limits for PACs and parties and candidates, because it's been 18 years since contribution limits have been increased.
Right.
And during that period of time, there's been about an 80% increase in inflation, right?
Right.
With the way that inflation has been going recently, we felt that the contribution limit increases in the bill was right in terms of making up for inflation,
right,
as well as accounting for a lot of Supreme Court decisions with regard to the need to increase contribution limits and adjust the limits and so forth. So that's the position we've called for.
It's one you've taken and you've articulated it well. We may respond, and I say we, both the organization I'm affiliated with, but also the broader reform community, without quite the nuance and understanding that you bring to it. But I guess there's a concern that, yes, we'd like to increase transparency and remove or shine light on the dark money. Maybe that's the right metaphor to use. That's been shrouded from public accountability, and it seems to have been growing. But there's also less than full enthusiasm, to be full candor with you, on just the whole idea of increasing money even to groups that are currently regulated. So while I understand your point of view, and I can assure you our organization will do nothing to stand in the way of this act, and I've often said, and it is a cardinal principle of mine in my public life, or the work that I do in public, I don't make the ideal the enemy of the good. I follow that, and I recognize that sometimes you have to come in for some criticism, and some people that have asked me for my opinion on this law, and I've expressed it, have responded with a little criticism of my point of view, saying, well, gee, I thought we were against big money in politics, no matter what the source or however it's regulated. I'm not thin-skinned on these issues, and and hearkening back to the experience I described earlier in our conversation about working with the Science and Technology Commission and the legislators, I understand how legislation and action happens, and it's the old sausage metaphor. But you also have to try to keep other people engaged. So I guess the short answer to we will continue to watch what you're doing, express enthusiasm for it. Perhaps not the level of on the street organizing that we have done at an earlier point for this particular bill, but by all means, great interest. And what is your forecast in terms of the bill coming up for a vote, perhaps before this current legislative session ends? I guess we have to do everything by 2023, or the bills die.
Yeah, I guess I would say that I'm hopeful that,
Okay.
well, the legislative process as well as I do. I'm hopeful that it'll come up again, because it did have it does have bipartisan support. The bill, and it did move, and I'm not quite sure why it didn't go through the assembly, but I think you had mentioned the contribution limits, and I think one of the problems with that was that it was the perception was, oh, you're doubling the contribution limits, but nobody was taking into account Supreme Court decisions, which basically say you really, it's okay, and you really should adjust these contribution limits for inflation, and the fact that it hasn't been changed since 2013. So you're talking about inflation of 18%, and campaign inflation is even more significant when you're talking about advertising costs and administrative costs and so forth in terms of campaigns, and the fact that we're between Philadelphia, which is and New York, which are expensive media markets, and so it does cost a little bit of money to run a campaign in New Jersey. So we're taking all of those kinds of things into account in proposing and recommending and supporting the contribution limit increases, but that was a problem for the League of Women Voters. And pay-to-play was a problem for some of the other groups. With regard to pay-to-play, we've called for a simplification of it, one state law to apply across the board, which makes sense to us rather than having, a hodgepodge of executive orders and local ordinances and fair and open exemption and so forth. Just that one state law that applies to everybody in terms of pay-to-play. Pay-to-play, of course, trying to connect the dots between a contribution and a public contract that's given. And so our pay-to-play law is so confusion that it's hard to enforce, and it's hard for people to comply with. And so we think that simplifying it would make it a lot stronger of a law. So that's where we're kind of coming from.
Well, again, we applaud the work you're doing, and hope that I guess the holdup at this point is in the assembly side, right?
Yeah, that's where it was stalled in,
Right.
in the assembly.
So,
Again, not quite sure exactly why. I think it had something to do with the contribution limit increases. I didn't get the sense it had to do with independent, expenditures,
right.
because we did narrow. My legal director did, Demery Roberts did an awful lot of work with me with regard to try to tailor the independent expenditure part of the bill to Judge Martinotti's decision,
Mm-hmm.
to have it conform to some of the problems that were in that decision
Yep.
with regard to that, to narrowly tailoring it, and a shorter time frame for 60 days before the election and so forth for reporting of it, which were some of the problems that were found in that court case.
Yeah. I don't want to sound the note of or appear to be a Cassandra on this issue, but I hope, first of all, I hope the law makes it through both chambers and the governor signs it, but I equally hope that, I don't think we can be naive to think that there won't be court challenges.
No, I think there's no doubt.
And in fact, I know you've said on several occasions, calling attention to the lesser-known aspect of the Citizens United decision, where I guess then Justice or Associate Justice Kennedy spoke about the opportunity for disclosure, and that the
Scalia.
was it Scalia?
Scalia.
Okay.
Late.
As opposed to the 5-4 decision, which may have determined the major effect of Citizens United. I guess that was an 8-1 decision on disclosure. Was that the way that vote turned out? Anyway.
Yeah, I forget the exact.
Yeah, there's some dark clouds.
Yeah.
You can tell from some of the things I've said today, Jeff, that I share. I worry out loud about where the U.S. Supreme Court is going. And I know you and I have had some friendly, I believe, disagreement as to whether we can still refer to it as the Roberts Court. That may be
Some people say the Thomas Court.
Well,
right?
I was one of those, and the reason I'm invoking that is he's been pretty outspoken about even the need to disclose. So I guess fingers crossed on this one that the Scutari bill makes it through the Assembly, and that Governor Murphy signs it. But also fingers crossed that the judicial process doesn't wind up derailing it again in a very different court.
I think what you said
than
is absolutely on target, and I think we anticipate that no matter what bill is passed with regard to independent expenditures, is going to be challenged.
Right.
So that's why we've been working very hard to make it as constitutionally sound as possible.
So, I mean, many of the reforms, you've heard me speaking with great regard for ranked choice voting and the experience that have recently been reported on in the state of Alaska. I had the opportunity a week or so ago to talk to the executive director of a group called Alaskans for Better Elections, which is a citizen group that is organized, and I asked him whether in fact, and I almost felt I knew the answer before he said whether the usual suspects were not challenging the new Alaska law in court, and of course they are, and it turns out to be the Koch network and many of the other deep-pocketed groups that we're familiar with for the on the dark money. So the ability to have a smooth sailing in terms of kind of mopping your brow when you finally get, in the state of Georgia, the governor's signature on it, is unfortunately not necessarily the end of the process.
So
of the
kind
story.
of Don Quixote at
That's
the windmills, right? I mean, with this, trying to get this passed, but
There you go.
hopefully we'll just keep plugging away, and
Well,
and
you do
hopefully
great work, Jeff, and I don't know how my work will be judged, but I do get up every day and just, dust myself off and just
Yeah,
get back
that's
into
all.
the fray, because
all you
the
can do.
work is important.
Yeah.
And it's not that I'm important, but the work is important, and you just keep plugging away to see what you can get done. And
Yeah.
we've had some proud accomplishments, and I hope to have some in the future.
No, you certainly have. Well, I think we're pretty much at the end of the interview. Is there anything else you'd like to conclude with?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to share the experience. I hope it's been useful. Certainly, I'm honored that you thought that this organization deserves the kind of recognition in the history project that you're doing, that you've given to former governors and speakers of the assembly and Senate presidents and so forth. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
No, absolutely.
To
I mean, one thing that I believe very strongly in trying to encourage is more civility in politics. And I mean, and that means that everybody has a voice and people can disagree.
Right.
But to use the old term, disagree in an agreeable way.
Right.
In a sense. So I think.
You mean not mounting the barricades
exactly.
to invade the U.S. Congress,
right.
if you don't like
right.
it.
So I always feel that there's common ground that can be found between groups that may disagree on the majority of things, but there's always something that it can be agreed upon, and
it's a principle
and
we
move
share,
forward.
but we operate both without blinders on, I'm sure, and the recognition that we live in very perilous times, that these are not necessarily, they're deeply concerning. They're not shared values by all our citizens. I would only say that this great experiment that we've had going for several hundred years of democracy is not carved in stone. Yes, we have a constitution, a U.S. and state constitutions, but to achieve the ongoing effectiveness of the democratic process requires precisely the kind of recognition that you've talked about, of being able to disagree but still remain civil and go forward, and also to acknowledge when someone has won or lost an election. So.
Right, exactly. Well, I want to thank you. We've been
Thank you
talking
very
with David Goodman of Represent, I'm saying that right, Represent U.S., right?
Actually not, it's Represent Us.
Represent Us. Okay.
But that's all right.
Well, it works both ways, I think.
Well,
anyway.
Thank you.
But thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having
It's
me.
been a pleasure, and I think it's been a very informative session that we've had here,
Well,
discussion that we've had.
Hope I've made a contribution, but
Absolutely.
happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah.